Hi everybody, it's David from Doctors of Running, and today we are going to be doing a comparison video between the Hoka Cielo X1 and the Hoka Cielo X1 2.0. This is a continuation of the Cielo X1, and there are some similarities, but there's also some pretty major differences as well. So I will go into all of the similarities and differences here in a second, but I did want to go over some of the specifications first. So starting off with the original Hoka Cielo X1, this one was a little bit on the heavier side for a super shoe. So this was 9.3 ounces in a men's size 10 and 7.4 ounces in a women's size 8. This was a 7mm drop platform. We did not have published stack height results, but it was World Athletics legal, so we can assume around 40. So that would put it at 40 in the heel and 33 in the forefoot. When we look at the Hoka Cielo X1 2.0, this shoe is a little bit lighter. It's 8.1 ounces in men's size 10 and 6.8 ounces in women's size 8. So they took off an entire ounce off of this shoe, and I think it does show. The general liveliness of the shoe is very different, and the experience is different in most ways, but the forefoot is pretty similar. So we'll get into that in a second. But I want to start off with the fit and the upper. When we look at the original Hoka Cielo X1, this one had a little bit more of a knit type upper to it. It was on the thicker side. It held and reinforced pretty well. The tongue was gusseted, and the general fit throughout was decently wide for a super shoe. So when we look at the heel and the midfoot and the forefoot, it was decently spacious while still having a pretty good lockdown over the midfoot. When we look at the Hoka Cielo X1 2.0, this shoe is a little bit more streamlined. The upper is a little bit more of a synthetic mesh, kind of a translucent mesh there. The tongue is not gusseted in this one, but it's a pretty cozy material. It's a really soft, lightweight mesh that goes over the top there. A little bit more of a traditional lacing feel and system to it. It does lock down well. The heel and the midfoot are normal width, maybe just a little bit more narrow than the original model. The forefoot is still decently wide, and the volume in both of these models is still decently spacious. So I wouldn't expect any issues with foot swelling or anything like that in either model. When we look at the ride, that is where we see a lot of the differences. And so in the initial model, so when we look at the Hoka Cielo X1, this shoe was very biased in the heel. You have a pretty wide platform, and the geometry of the shoe is very dependent on you kind of crashing into that heel and really aggressively rolling through that forefoot. So the rocker was very aggressive for a super shoe, and the foam was very bouncy and compliant. There was a lateral cutout here, and there was a little bit of lateral instability that I wrote in the review as well at the time. So on cambered roads where you had a slight little angle, it did feel like I would kind of turn my ankle every once in a while, or if I was turning into the side of that shoe, especially if it was angled. So they changed that in the Cielo X2. So in the Cielo X2, there's no lateral cutout. There's a medial cutout, but they also changed the heel geometry. So when we look at the heel's a little bit more narrow, and you have a cutout that kind of goes through the midline here of the heel and then extends medially into the shoe. I will say, for those that are traditional heel strikers or a little bit more aggressive on the rear foot, this heel is more unstable than the original Cielo X1. The Hoka Cielo X2 is very midfoot biased, midfoot and forefoot. This shoe really wants you to be right over that midfoot and then just kind of roll forward into that bouncy forefoot. Now, the forefoot rocker on both of these models is still decently similar. It's a pretty sharp toe spring, and it's a pretty stiff plate. Like, if I go to bend that thing, I'm not going to. When I look at the Cielo X1 2.0, there's a tiny bit more bend, but it's still pretty stiff. But this one almost reminds me a little bit more of the Mizuno Wave Rebellion 3, where you have a very strong midfoot bias that rolls into that forefoot. Looking at traction between the two models, traction was pretty decent on both models. I didn't really have any issue with grip, and I feel like there's decent outsole coverage for a super shoe. Weight-wise, it definitely is night and day. The Cielo X1 2.0 is much lighter. You feel more nimble, but you do feel like you're very midfoot biased, and so at slower paces, it can feel a little bit bumpy on that heel. Once you start to pick up the pace and get the legs underneath you a little bit more, the transitions smoothen out a lot more, and you're kind of leaning, you're just a little bit more forward when you're running a little bit quicker. So I feel like at race pace, this is a true racing shoe where I feel like some people could justify the Cielo X1 kind of as a long run shoe or even a training shoe for some people. So I think when we look at the crowds of runners that might be looking at these shoes, like if you wanted something that was a little bit heavier, had a little bit more support on it, like the Cielo X1 could have been a super shoe that even like a 4-hour marathon crowd could have worn, as long as they were okay with some of the lateral instability. But the weight might have been a little heavy for some of the people that were really wanting to push the pace on the top end. Obviously, the professionals seem to quiet those thoughts all of the time. I remember Chrissy Gear winning a road mile in the Cielo X1, but it's definitely on the heavier side, whereas the Cielo X1 2.0 it's a more aggressive design. It really wants you to be forward off that midfoot and forefoot, and this is something that really comes alive when you pick up the pace. So whereas I would probably never run a 5K in the Cielo X1, the Cielo X1 2.0, you probably could justify a 5K in this shoe. I think it still leans 10K and up, where for me, putting it through its paces, I do think it responded really well at that half marathon pace and at the marathon. But I think it's also going to be largely dependent on the runner and their own given biomechanics. If you are someone that tends to gravitate towards the midfoot or forefoot bias shoes, this could be a super shoe worth looking into for you. I know amongst our own team, Andrea has been liking the Cielo X1 2.0, whereas Klein, who's a little bit more of an aggressive rear foot striker, has found a lot of instability in this area. So even amongst our own team, we're having very different experiences. I tend to lean a little bit more in the middle. I do like the shoe, but I do feel like it's a niche crowd that will agree with this. Looking at pace-wise, I made the 4-hour comment with the Cielo X1. I think the slower population, more recreational running, unless you're really good at striking through that midfoot and forefoot and you're very comfortable in that area, I don't know if I would recommend this for most people. But for those that are trying to go a little bit quicker and like that midfoot bias, they can have that. Largely speaking, though, responsiveness-wise, both shoes will give you a good amount of responsiveness and a good amount of bounce. You just have a little bit more structure to the Cielo X1 original. The Cielo X1 2.0 is definitely more midfoot and forefoot biased. So that is our head-to-head video between the Hoka Cielo X1 and the Hoka Cielo X1 2.0.